So first of all, thanks a lot for having me. My name's Rob. Contact info there. I work for a consultancy called Conrad Group. We're just downtown in Toronto. I build web apps there, and I'm doing a lot of Angular for the last couple of years. So I wanted to talk to you guys about kind of getting started with Angular, the basics of it, and there's a bit of a .NET twist. So I'm going to go through like building a really simple Angular app with a web API backend. So as you probably know, Angular is a client-side JavaScript framework. And one thing that kind of makes Angular unique is the way it approaches HTML. So HTML is kind of designed to be static, and for modern web pages that just doesn't really work. So a lot of the modern frameworks have different ways of kind of abstracting away your HTML to make it more dynamic. Whereas Angular tries to extend your HTML to make the actual HTML itself more dynamic. So this kind of leads to very declarative and readable and quick to write HTML. So let's take a look at what that might look like. So just have a super basic little hello world site right here. I have this index.html file. I'm actually using the Razor format from ASP. Normally, if you're using Angular, you really want to limit how much server-side rendering you do. So for here, I'm just using it to kind of package up all my CSS files, all my JavaScript library files, and all my application files. And then I'll kind of let Angular do all the rest of the kind of dynamic page rendering and whatnot. If we take a look at the bundle file, this is what kind of just configures what's going into those different packages. My library file, or my library bundle, doesn't have anything in it right now. So we want to add Angular to this bundle. So there's lots of ways you can get Angular, but we can try getting it through NuGet. So we just go to our NuGet manager. I can search Angular. I should find that online if I spell it right. Let's check that. And find Angular core here, so we can install that. And what that will do is just add angular.js to our scripts folder. So now we can include that in the bundle. So that would just be under script/angular.js. And now our HTML file should be including Angular, so we can try using it. The way you do binding in Angular is with these double curly braces. So if I do something like 1 + 3, Angular should recognize that and evaluate that expression. So if we run this little application, you can see it serve out this file. And spoiler alert, it's not going to work. Oh, there we go. Didn't work. So there's actually two things you need to do to get Angular working. So we included angular.js on the page, but the one other thing is we need to tell Angular basically where on the page we want it to actually run. So you could basically confine Angular to just one div tag or something, and everything else outside of that is not really part of your Angular app. Well, let's just put Angular on the body. So if I just say ng app, this will tell Angular that everything inside the body tag is part of our Angular app. So if we refresh the page now, hopefully we'll see that Angular is now evaluating that expression. Okay, not too exciting, but we're getting there. Let's try doing something a bit more interesting. So let's try adding a text input. And we can hook this up to Angular by adding a directive called ngModel. So I'll explain more in a little bit what directives are, but I'm just going to give it the name of a variable, so I'll call this myValue. And what this will do is Angular will watch whatever we type into this text input and assign and store the value in this myValue variable. So just to see that something actually is getting stored there, we can just evaluate it and show what's in that variable. So I'll just evaluate it right afterwards. Now if we refresh this and start typing something in here, we see that it is in fact getting stored in that variable, and then we're seeing it right away kind of as we type right on the screen. Now I said that Angular is good at making kind of declarative HTML. So you really want to limit how much of these kind of JavaScript expressions you put into your HTML. So this 1 + 3 thing, I mean obviously super trivial, but you want to limit that sort of stuff that you put in your HTML, and you want to kind of abstract that away into a JavaScript controller, maybe give it a function name or something. So we can take a look at how you start integrating a JavaScript controller. That's not it. called main controller. So this is kind of just the boilerplate for a controller. This first line here, I'm setting up an Angular module. Before, we were just using a generic Angular module, letting Angular create one, so we can tell it to now use our custom module that we're setting up. And this here is just kind of what's going to be our controller class. And then this line here is just registering that controller with Angular so that we can start using it in Angular. So to use this controller, we can use another directive, ng controller. And I'll just say we want to use main controller and give it an alias, ctrl, and then we'll just refer to it as that inside our body tag. So now I can start interacting with functions and variables in my controller in the view, in the HTML. So if I create a variable here, we'll just say, call it my value again equals initial value. Now in our HTML, if we want to refer to that variable, we just need to prefix this with controller. So we can just say controller.myValue, controller.myValue, and when we refresh the page, we should now see that we're getting that initial value from the JavaScript, and we can still change it from our view. So this is kind of Angular's famous two-way data binding. So we're able to set a variable from our controller and from the actual view, and those two variables will just stay totally bound together by Angular. We don't really have to think about updating the view when we change something in the controller or vice versa. So this is like a really powerful tool, and let's take a look at a bit more fleshed out of an application and see what we can do with it. So I'm just going to check out the next branch of this repo. Any imminent questions while I'm doing that?
No.
Okay, let's try it out. And yeah, obviously we'll have lots of time for questions at the end as well. Okay, so if we run this app again, we've just got a bit more code in there now. Let's see, Internet Explorer. Okay, so now we have like a kind of scaffolding for a little application. All it's going to do is get some stocks, display them in a table, give you some information about them, and let you search for them. My apologies for the dry topic. I originally pitched this at some investors to try and sell them on Angular, so that's why it's about stocks. If we look at our controller, just same thing as we had before, but now we have this kind of hard-coded array in here, which is just has a few objects that have some information about stocks. And in our HTML, we have a table, so we basically want to generate a new row in this table for each element in that array. So you can do kind of like a for each in Angular with ng repeat. So I can say ng repeat stock in the controller's stocks info. And this should basically duplicate this block of HTML for each element in that array. So we can just test.
This isn't in those curly brackets.
Right. So the curly brackets are just kind of for evaluating expressions, but these directives, like these attributes I have on elements, they can kind of have like parameters that we pass into those that aren't necessarily being evaluated right away.
So it's because it's ng-repeat.
Yeah. So this is like a special Angular element. It knows to look at that string that I'm passing in and evaluate that as an expression. It's a little bit confusing because sometimes you're not sure whether you need to evaluate it or whether Angular knows that it's going to evaluate it. But
Sure.
yeah, in this case, Angular will kind of take care of basically putting that in the curlies for us. So yeah, if we refresh this, we should see some rows getting generated. Okay, cool. Now we have a row for each element in our array there. So now it's just a matter of basically binding to the actual fields in those like stock.
Why did it populate those rows with the word test?
Oh, I just wrote the word test in there just so it would show something, just to make sure that our ng-repeat was actually like generating 3 rows.
Sure.
But now let's try and put some interesting data in there, or more meaningful data. So we can just bind to all the fields on this stock object. So take its symbol change, percent change, volume. So now if we refresh the page, we should see now we have all that data from our controller, except for volume, which I spelled name volume.
I'm going to buy some Apple stocks.
Yeah, this is all completely fake data as well. So don't put too much faith into it.
Safe harbor.
You notice that the volume here is kind of hard to read. It's like a big number. It'd be nice if we could kind of format that. So Angular has a couple kind of out-of-the-box formatters. They're called filters. So one of them is called number. So we can kind of run this through this number filter. If we refresh it, now we see it's kind of nicely formatted as a number. And we could run this through. There's also a built-in currency filter. So we could run it through currency, and then we get some dollar signs and fixed number of decimal places. And the idea with this pipe syntax is kind of like a Unix shell where you're like piping a bunch of commands together. So a filter is just a super basic function that just takes some input and outputs something, and you can chain as many of them together as you want and like kind of write your own filters. One of the more interesting filters that comes out of the box with Angular is called filter. So it's the filter, which is a little bit confusing, but basically what this does is it'll take an array and take some string as input and basically check for each element in that array, it'll check all the fields in that object and see if they match that string, and then it'll only give you back the ones that match. So if we want to search the stuff here, we can just take the string that we type into the search box and run it through the filter. So the search box has another ng model that's assigning to controller.search. So whatever we type into the box will be in this controller.search variable. So if I just pass that into filter, we should be able to now search. So I type Apple, it only shows me the Apple stock. And this is searching across any field, so I can type like -1.9, and it's showing me the match for this stock here. And also notice that it's super fast because we're not doing any round trip requests to the server. This is all just client side. Our client side framework is taking care of this. You can get some really snappy kind of user feedback with features like this. Now in this example, we have all our data kind of hard coded in our JavaScript file, which obviously is not going to happen in the real world. You'll probably have it in like a database somewhere with a web service you need to hit to get at it. So let's try and get it through a web service. I mentioned there's a web API backend for this. It's not doing a whole lot right now. We just have a really basic little controller here. So we just set up an endpoint. So if I send a request to this endpoint, it'll call one of these functions. So if I send a GET request, it's going to call this function, which is going to go and look up some stocks and return this like list of stock info objects. And Web API will kind of just take care of converting that into JSON from C# objects and vice versa. So let's try sending a GET request to this from our Angular app. So we can get rid of this hard-coded data and try and load some more real stuff. So Angular has a built-in kind of utility class for sending HTTP requests called $HTTP. And just by naming this as a parameter in this function, Angular will recognize it and dependency inject it for us. So that's basically all we need to do to get an instance of it. So now I can start using it. It has a .get method if we want to do a GET request. So what was that URL we want to send? So this URL here. So this will send a GET request to that URL. This function returns a promise. Promises are kind of more powerful alternatives to callback functions. So on this promise, I can call .then and then give that a function. In this case, I'm not really taking advantage of the full power of promises, but we're basically just giving it a callback function. This function will be called when the server returns with that data. It'll pass us back a response. So all I need to do is just basically set that stocks info variable we were using before with the data from the server, which wants that data. So now if we refresh the page, you should see it's now loading a bunch of stocks from the server. And we can kind of take a look at what's happening here, which is a cool feature kind of Visual Studio is that we can debug our front end and back end kind of at the same time. So if I set some breakpoints in our Web API backend and in our JavaScript front end and refresh the page, first we see our controllers being instantiated. This HTTP is being passed in. We see Angular's, figured out how to dependency inject it, and it has this GET method that we're going to be using. So I step down. Now we're going to send the request to the server. So I'm going to let the code continue, and now the breakpoint on our server gets hit. So we can kind of step into this function, see how it's getting the stocks. We see our server just actually has a hard-coded list, but it's a little bit more real than having it hard-coded on the client. And it's got all these kind of C# objects, which are going to get converted into JSON. So it's just going to return that list of stocks, and then our callback function gets called, and we can see this response.data now has all that data that we just passed back from the server. And that's kind of how we're getting it. And then it's still, pretty snappy to search this list kind of as we type. So any questions at this point? I'm going to switch to another kind of iteration of this app.
Imagine how fast it is.
Yeah,
It's
it's-
not a lot of data, but that's
Yeah,
amazing.
and you can get quite a bit of data on the page before you start running into performance issues. If you had like a really complex view where it wasn't just like rows in a table, but it was actually, like some separate component for each, item in a list, and you had like 3,000 things in a list, you could start to run into some performance issues. But, for most reasonable UIs, you're not going to be showing that much information to your user anyway. So, it's pretty snappy for most use cases. Every now and then you'll need to do a bit of performance tweaking, but not too often. Okay, so let me just undo these changes, and we'll check out the next iteration of this app. All right, so I'm going to run this again, and we'll see what we have now. All right, so now we're going to try and set up multiple pages and try and do some routing through Angular. So the idea is that this overview page will be basically that table we saw and just set up, and then the details page will just have one stock on it, and we'll be able to see some more detailed information about it. And you can see right now it's changed. Well, I don't know if you can see that, but it's changing the URL up here to #overview when we're on overview, and #details when we're on details. So let's get Angular to try and load in our overview page when we're on when the URL is at /overview. So the code has been moved around a little bit. Now we have our overview stuff all in this overview.html instead of it just being right in the index.html. But this is basically exactly what we had before. So we just want to tell Angular to load up this HTML template whenever the URL is overview. And in our index.html, now instead of having that table, we have this special element ngView. And this is another directive from Angular. And this will basically be replaced with whatever the current route is. So we can set that up now. So this is a configure block for Angular where you can kind of configure the routing and configure a few other things with your Angular application. So we can use this route provider from Angular. It just has a when method on it. So we can say when the URL is /overview, then we want to load up that overview HTML. So we can say load up the template URL of, and that is in our client folder /pages overview /overview.html. And if I didn't make any typos, I should. I did. Okay. Oh, yeah. Yep. Good catch. This is the advantage of mass programming in front of a bunch of people. There we go. Now it works. So now when we go to our overview page, we're dynamically loading in that HTML. Our details page still isn't doing anything, so we can just kind of duplicate this line and swap out overview for HTML, or for details. So details page. And if I refresh this, now we should be able to go to a details page. So on here, you'll be able to select like a particular stock and see some details about it. And if you can see, the URL is /details, and then there's a query string of symbol equals like the symbol for that stock. So it'd be nice if we could just click on a row in this table and have it kind of take us to that details page with the query string pre-populated. And there's actually, in our overview controller, there's already a function that's kind of doing that for us. So there's this go-to stock details. And it's using this another built-in service from Angular, this location service, setting the path to details, and then setting the query string to the symbol of whatever stock we kind of pass into this function. So we can hook this up in our HTML. We basically want to call that function whenever someone clicks on the row. So to set up a click event, you can just say ng-click, and then we can call our function, go to stock details, and pass in the stock info. And now if we click on something, it should take us to that stocks page, or to the details page. You might notice that this detailed information is the exact same information that's on our overview page, so we're not actually getting any details.
We get the concept.
Yeah. Yeah. We can try adding some more info here, though. Like, it'd be cool if we had a graph that showed the history of this stock over time. And in our details controller, we actually have a function that is loading up some kind of fake price data, and it's setting it in this stock prices variable. So we can try and use that to kind of generate a graph on our details page. So let's go to our details. And let's say we're foreseeing into the future that we're going to want to use this graph on a bunch of different pages in our app. So we want this to be like a reusable component. And this is another use case for a directive. So I'll take a minute to explain all the different things you can do with directives, because basically in Angular everything is a directive. But there's three kind of main use cases. So one that we've seen, let's take a look at the overview. Like this ngClick is a directive, and it kind of adds functionality to an existing element. So it adds, a click handler to this row. And in Angular 1, these are all just called directives. In Angular 2, which is coming out, this type of directive will be called a decorator. And it kind of just helps just to keep yourself sane, to think of them as in these like three separate use cases, so you can kind of come up with best practices for each use case. Another use case is this ngRepeat. So this is kind of going to turn this HTML into just a template, and then it can duplicate it, generate it, remove it, add it to the DOM, and stuff like that. So that's kind of like a template directive. And then what we're going to be creating is like a component. So we want just a block of kind of HTML and JavaScript that we can drop into any page just using a directive. So I have the kind of boilerplate for a directive set up here. So this line here, we're just getting an instance of our Angular module, and then we're just registering a directive on it called stockchart, which currently doesn't do anything. We can give it some HTML just inline for now. I'll just give it some placeholder HTML. Let's say to do put a graph here. And now if we use this stockchart directive in our details view, we should be able to see that kind of little HTML text that we entered. So stock chart. So now if I refresh this page, now you can see we have this little fairly useless but reusable component that we can just drop in using our custom stock chart element. And you can kind of pick whether you want to use it as an attribute. So we could also say div with stock chart as an attribute, and that'll basically do the same thing. And you can kind of restrict it to be one or the other if you want in your directive, but we'll just kind of leave it open-ended for now. And just to show this is reusable, we can copy paste that a few times. We could drop that in on any page and get this here. But if we're going to be creating a graph and we want it to be reusable, then we're going to need to pass in all the data for it. Because then it could be a graph that's loading up different data on a different page or something like that. And I mentioned that our details controller has this stock prices data that we want to pass into the graph. So I can pass it in kind of as a parameter with another attribute. So we can say the series equals the controller's stock prices. And then on the directive side, we can access that data if we set up a scope. So we can just basically say what's going to be on the scope of this directive. And we wanted a series variable. And the syntax is a little confusing, but this basically means it's going to be a two-way binding of that variable. So if it changes on the directive side, it'll be updated. And if it changes on the outside of the directive side, it'll also be updated. But with that, we can start just binding it into our view just to show that it's actually being passed in. So we bind series in there and reload this. We should see now we've got all this data being passed into our directive. And it's just tuples of like timestamps and the value of a stock. So with that, it's really just a matter of finding a third-party graphing application and passing this series in, and then we have this reusable component. But just to save us some time, I'm going to copy paste that in. So I'm going to use a third-party library called HiStocks. And this looks like a bunch more code, but it's mostly just configuration, like saying what the title is and what the X and Y axis are. And then here we're passing that series into HiStocks, and then it should basically generate a graph for us. So if we reload this, yay, now we have a pretty graph of this stock, and we can, just drop that into any page. If we go back to our HTML.
Where's that library that's drawing that image?
So this is a library called HiStocks. I got it through NuGet as well. I think. No, maybe.
Another JavaScript library
Yeah.
in your solution?
Actually, yeah. So sorry, here it is. I just downloaded it and put it into this lib folder. But yeah, it's just a pretty easy to use and configurable graphing library. They have one called HiCharts, which is just like generic charts, and HiStocks, which is for like stock-based charts. Yeah, so that's pretty much all it takes to build up like a reusable component like this and be able to drop that onto a page. So another kind of core concept in Angular is that it was really built to be testable. So I just have one unit test to kind of show how this might look. And it's integrated into Visual Studio through a plugin called Chutzpah, which will just let us kind of run all of our Angular tests and see them from our test explorer here. But yeah, we have a unit test here, and I'll just go over kind of what this is doing. So it's a unit test that's going to test our overview controller. This is just a description of it. It's not actually doing anything. And before each test runs, we're going to do some setup. So it's going to initialize our Angular module that we set up. And then it's going to inject some things from Angular, like this HTTP backend service. And this is another kind of out-of-the-box service from Angular that helps you mock out your backend. So in the unit test, we want it to be totally isolated, not actually have to hit our real backend. So we're going to use this HTTP backend and say, when I see a GET request to this URL, instead of letting that actually hit the server, we're just going to respond with this hard-coded response in our unit test. And then all the unit test is going to do is instantiate the controller. So it's going to create that overview controller, and then this is our unit test here, and it's going to make sure that the controller got the stock info object from that HTTP request, even though we kind of faked it out. And as you see, like in the controller, that's the first thing our controller does. It just goes and loads this and stores the result in this stocks info object. So a unit test is just, where'd my unit test go? The unit test is just testing that. And if something breaks and I just save the file, this like Chutzpah plugin will rerun my test, and you can see now our tests are failing. But yeah, this is just like a super small example of just one unit test, but there's a lot of great tools that Angular gives you for doing unit testing and also actually end-to-end testing. They have a product built kind of on top of Selenium that gives you ways to do like in-browser testing that knows some things about Angular, so you don't have to put in as many weights, and you can bind to Angular expressions and stuff like that.
What about load testing that?
What's that?
What about load testing?
So they actually just came out with a new product called BenchPress because a lot of the complaints, I think, from Angular 1 were getting into issues where you have all this data that's kind of on the page and you're running into performance issues. So Angular 2, they're really focusing on the performance. So it's all, that's kind of like one of the first things they developed was this BenchPress tool where you can do kind of load testing. And I think you can use it on an Angular 1 app, but I'm not totally sure. I haven't tried it. It's like a brand new thing they just released. But yeah, it's a good question. I think that's pretty much all I wanted to cover. So yeah, I guess I opened it up to other questions.
I'm wondering about, is it common to do this type of thing where you're getting data using a web service? Or?
Yeah, so it's kind of designed to work with like a REST backend, something like that. So yeah, Web API worked really well for that because it's really easy to just build some endpoints that serve you up some JSON. And that's kind of the standard use case, like a single page application that does all its own routing and loads everything through Ajax basically.